In this demo, we'd like to implement a simple mocking framework which will allow us to invoke methods and register stub implementation for methods. But since we are using pure reflection and not any AOP frameworks, we will be able to intercept and mock only methods that are implemented from interfaces. So let's just start by creating a new Java project. Let's call this project mocking. I'm not going to use any new feature in Java 8. Let's create here a package called mocking, and I'm going to create a new source folder which will hold a test. We'll do this in a test-driven manner, but actually it's not going to be JUnit test or something like that. I'm just going to create here a simple console class that's going to actually consume the mock. So what I'd like to be able to do here, let's say that I have a list of integers. And let's call this even numbers. And I'm going to create here a mock. I like to be able to mock a list so that each time we add something to the list, instead of calling the real method to add, it's going to do our own method. So let's just create in the framework itself a class called mock, and this is going to be mocking a given type. So I like to be able here to mock a type. In order to do so, to create the mock itself, I need to have a static method which will get the generic parameter t. Is going to return an object of type t. Let's call the method mock, and this will receive a type which should be the type that we need to mock, and for the beginning we return none. So let's say that here I'd like to mock a list, and because we are using a generic type, first of all the method is not imported, so I'll do a static import here. From my mock, I'll import the mock method, and I'm going to do a suppress warning for that. So what I like to be able to do is to intercept and to register stubs for the method of the mock, so that each time we are calling a method, we should be able to receive the call and implement our own call instead. So I'd like to be able to bind the result of invoking a method, but not just to a value, but also to a method. So let's say that I have a mock method which is going to return a boolean in my case, because I'm going to intercept the add method. This does not exist, so I'm going to create this class, but not in the test framework, rather in the source framework. So I have here defined a method which is going to be an add mock method, and this is actually I don't want to have a class here but an interface. Okay, so that when I call the method, so this is going to be my method, and in here I like to be able to have a method to return a boolean. Let's call this invoke, which will receive an object array of arguments, and that's just I'm returning false for the beginning. This method, it's added here, but it should be in the interface, should be the contract of the interface, so I'm going to change this. The mock method will actually return an object of type v. This is going to be the interface, and it will receive an array of objects. Okay, so this method, with this method, I'm able to be invoked each time something needs to be executed by the real method, by the method of the object I'm intercepting, I'm mocking actually. Okay, so in here that's gonna be easy. I check, for instance, that I have arguments and that my arguments contain only one element, and that one element is an integer because I use a list of integers, and if so, I'm gonna cast this to an integer, the arguments of index 0, and I'm gonna check the division of this to 2 and return accordingly. So I allow only adding even numbers to the list. But now I'd like to be able to start registering stubs with my mock. So I'd like to be able to have a with method, and then with even numbers I'd like to be able to register the stubs. So let's just create a with method in my mock class. Of course, this is going to be also a static method, and in this case my with method will return the mock received. So this is going to be a static method which will return a mock of t, the with method. Okay, and this will return actually the proxy that I created when starting mocking. And now I think it is time for us to focus on implementing the method themselves. I'm returning a null here as well, just to show you how this should work. So in here I will import the second method within my mock, this with. So now the code compiles, and I'd like to be able to start with registering stubs for the mock in here. If I go back to my mock, now I need actually to provide something for those two methods before actually continuing implementing services with the mock. Basically, when I do a mock, I need to intercept the calls with my type. First, I said that I'm not able to do this with classes, but rather with interfaces. So let's just say that I define here a list of interfaces, and I get if the type is an interface. I check if the type is an interface, and if so, I will use the type to be the interface I need to implement, because I know that if the type is extending some interfaces, which can be more than one, then the type will inherit all the methods of the interface, and if I implement the interface, just this one, then I will implement all the interfaces extended by the type. So there is no problem if the type is an interface, then all I have to do, I'm creating an array of classes which will contain only my type. This is going to be the interface. But if the type is a class, then I get all the interfaces implemented by the type. So what you can see here is that if I need to mock if I like to mock a type with pure reflection, I'm not able to mock the methods inside declared by the type if the type is a class, but I can mock all the interfaces, all the methods defined by the interfaces implemented by the type. Okay, of course with AOP I can even mock methods of the class, but this is not the purpose of this demo. This is intended to show how reflection can be used in order to create mocking frameworks. Now, let's just create a mock of type T. This is going to be my mock. So I'm creating this one. And I'd like to return a proxy using my mock. But in order to be able to do that, my mock should implement an invocation handler, should be an invocation handler. My mock is going to be actually handling all the invocations. So this is going to be actually an invocation handler. So this one should implement invocation handler. Invocation, sorry for that. Invocation handler. And because of that, it has to have an invoke method, which we'll implement later. So now what I do here, I'm just creating a new proxy. So I use the proxy of reflection. I'm creating a new proxy instance. I use the class loader of the type provided as argument. I have a list of interfaces, an array of interfaces, and I'm going to use my mock as being the invocation handler. This is going to actually provide an implementation of all the interfaces that are here. So with this, I can say that this should be casted to the type T that I need to provide to return, and I'm suppressing the warnings. So with this, what I'm doing actually, I am creating an interceptor for all the methods of the type in case the type is an interface, or for all the methods of the interface is implemented by the type in case the type is a class. Okay, so with this, now I can mock my list. Of course, this okay. The suppress warning should be added to the method instead of unused. Unused is because of this, but nevertheless we will get rid of this right away because of this solution. Anyway, so let's just continue implementing the with method of my mock. When I start using my mock, I'd like to be able to actually set some properties of my mock, like some arguments. So let's say that I define here inside my mock an object array for the arguments that needs to be set while defining a stub. So what I do here, I'd like to be able to create some arguments, a placeholder within my mock. So remember, this with method will be used in conjunction with an already created mock. So I say with and I provide as argument a mock. This mock is the invocation handler. It's the proxy created on top of the invocation handler. So what I'd like to be able to do here would be to access the arguments, to set the arguments of the proxy that I received as argument. So first of all, I will get the mock, and in order to get the mock, I can do something like this. The proxy can get the invocation handler within a proxy. The proxy class is able to do that. So if I provide the proxy here, as you can see, I'm providing the result of the mock, which is a proxy. So if I put a proxy here with invocation handler, with get invocation handler, I will actually get what I put here. So this will be a mock, and I know for sure that I put a mock of type T. So I can cast this to a mock of type T, and I can suppress the warning unchecked. Now I can say something like set the arguments in here as being a new object array. And I don't put anything in my object array. In the end, I just return the mock. The purpose of doing that, it's not quite obviously evident. The idea is that when I do a with, I would like to call a when, something like with this when I call even numbers.add of something of 10, let's say. When I do this, instead of let me just explain it for you briefly. Sorry. Let's imagine that I'd like to register stubs. So with my mock, I like to register when I call a method with some arguments, instead of actually dispatching the call to the object, to a real object, like to an instance of a list, which I don't use it, by the way. I like to be able to register some bindings for how to compute the value. So if I do this, if I start registering the the, the bindings, the stubs, I have to make a distinction between when this method is called for real and it should return a value according to the bindings I registered before, and when this is actually starting registering a binding. So the way I'm doing this is to set a state in my object, like I'm setting the arguments to be something, and if this will see that the arguments are set, instead of dispatching the code and trying to get the binding and return the appropriate value that has been registered before, the when method will be able to, actually the call of the add method will be able to know that it is in a with statement. It is used in conjunction with. So in order to do so, each time I start a with, I then set a state on my proxy, on my mock, so that the mock will know when its method will be called, not to dispatch the real call, I mean not to return what it's supposed to be returned, but instead to start registering a binding. Okay, so now let's go and implement the second method, the when. In here, I need to be able to have a when method. But this method is not going to be a static one, because I'm not going to use this without any parameter. So I need to have this when method on a mock itself, because the with will return the mock with some statement set, with some state set, and here I'm going to be able to continue registering the binding. So I say here, I need to have another public method, which in this case will return a binding. I need to be able to say when this method will be called and it will return this value, just return either a static value, a constant, or return a method to be invoked in order to get a value. Therefore, this method will return an element of type v. We'll create a mock binding, a mock result binding, let's say mock result binding. For mocks of type t with a value of type v, this will be my when method, and this will return a value which will be the context. So this class is not created. I'm gonna create this, will be the mock itself. Have to make sure it is in the framework, yes. So you should see things as follows. Mock result binding, it's my class, and in here I have the when. So it's like this in my program. When I like to register a binding, I get my mock and I start registering a binding for a value. So here I'll get the value returned by calling a method. And when I get the value, I'd like to be able to say then return, and in here I can put either a value of type returned by this method or a method which is gonna return a value of type returned by this method, so that when I later call for real the method, because the method is not implemented, of course I'm mocking the class, I will check and see if the method has a binding registered before, and then use the binding to return either the value set by the binding or to invoke the method registered by the binding in order to get the result of calling the method. Okay, so what I'd like to have as an argument for when will be a simple value that's going to be returned by the method. In this way, I am able to put in here for the when the result returned by the method, and I have to respect the type that is returned by the method. But then the when method is not gonna return the value itself, but it's gonna return a binding so that I can continue saying what to collect for the binding. Okay, so this is gonna be a simple method. I'm just returning a new mock result binding of type T and V. Okay, and I will provide this as the context of the binding. So I create a constructor in which my binding is receiving the context. So you should imagine that each time I do a when, I assign to a value what should be returned. And in my mock result binding, I should be able to define the return method, which is not defined yet, so this one can be created with the assistant. So what I do here, first of all, I need to store the context that I received. So let's say that I have this mock in my class and the field is created. When I'm returning, when I'm binding the return, I can have either a value, then return a value, and if I do this, this will have to say then return true or false. Okay. So because this method is returning a boolean and this one is collecting a value of this type, it will have to be a boolean as well. So this is one way of doing things. Okay. Or I can have something like then return, but instead I will receive a mock method of type V. This will be the method, and of course this can be used as I intended in the beginning with my add method, because my add method is returning a boolean. This will allow me to put on a binding that's going to return what this method is returning, which is a boolean. Okay, so now I have set what I need to use, but let's actually implement it because it is not implemented yet. So what I do here, when I say then return a value, I got my reference to the mock because I need to collect the binding inside my mock. So what I do here, I use the mock to say bind result. The method is not created, so I am creating the method in my mock class. And then when I bind the result, I like to put a binding to a result with a value. But because I have two types of obtaining the value, either as a constant, as a parameter here set by the user that's gonna call the method, or as a result of invoking a method. So for that, in order to adapt these two ways of getting the value, I am creating a mock result which is going to be holding values of type generic V, and this mock result will receive the value. So I create this class which will return the value, so that in here I put the value. So now I need to actually change the signature of the bind method in here. So as you can see, because of the fact that the bind method it is actually generic method, I need to put a parameter here. I don't like to have this publicly accessible, so I will just put this method, I change the visibility to package. This is going to be the result I bind to. Okay. So in here I'm creating this mock. I need to create a constructor with the appropriate signature for the mock result. So the mock result can store either a value or a method to compute the value. So this can store the value itself, no problem. But I can also would like to be able, with the mock result of type v, to receive a mock method of type v, which is going to be the method. What it does, will store the method inside the class, and I created the field for that. In order to execute this, I can have a get value method, and this is going to return the value, or I can have the get method getter, which is going to return the method. So this is a simple class storing a binding either to a value or to a method. So in the second place, when I do the binding with to a method, I will actually use the mock to bind the result, and this time I'm creating a new mock result with the method. Okay, so in this way the binding is done either to a value or to a method. So now I'm able actually to write my testing program with the logic that I need, except that I have an issue here. I had to put a real value, but I don't like to do this. So I like to be able to have matchers, like for instance when the method is called with any integer, then I'd like to be able to have this dispatched. Okay, so what I like to do next would be to define inside my mock class, let's say, a matcher. So the matcher should be static. I'd like to be able to statically import this. It's going to be a matcher to a value, a matcher for a value, and of course it will receive as an argument the type of the value. Actually, the matcher is going to return null because I'm not going to use any filter for the matcher. I just like to have the ability to say, when you call the method with any value of this type, then you should register a given binding. So in here, I'll then statically import the any method, and instead of saying with 10, I just say with any integer. Okay, so it's like this. Let me just format it for you. With this, when this method is called with any integer, then return the result of the mock method. So this is what I intended in the beginning to do. Of course, let's just finish testing the logic. Let's say that I have random number generator. I create random. Okay, just to show that I'm gonna add only even numbers. I then iterate with an integer I from 0, let's say, to 10, not to show too many values. And what I do, I get the value with a random, just by calling next integer of, let's say, 100. And then I get the Boolean result by calling the even numbers dot add of my integer I, of the value. I created the value for that. Okay, and then I just display the result on the console, saying that the result of calling the add method was this one, and I display the result. And of course I'd like to put the value that was used here. Okay, so because of the way I'm mocking the method and I'm adding only even numbers, as you can see here, when I generate random numbers and I try to add them to the list, I should be able to see that only even numbers were added, so the result should be true only for even numbers. Okay, so the method is not implemented yet. The mock is not working because I didn't implement the mapping itself, but the infrastructure is already in place. So I have the ability to register the bindings, to mock the call of a method with a value or a method. And now I only have to focus on implementing the mocking itself. So I have the infrastructure, now let's just consume the infrastructure. So the problem is that when I'm mocking, I need to store the bindings because I didn't actually implement the bind result method. Okay, so the bind result method is going to be the tricky part. Okay, so what I have to do first would be to set a context for the when, because the when method, when it's invoked, it will trigger the call to a method of the class, and this should store the real method for which I do the binding. So let's just say that inside my mock, I store the current method which is mocked. So I create here a field of type method, the one from reflection. Let's call the field method. Okay. Now comes the tricky part, and I'm gonna touch actually and implement the invoke method, which is gonna be the one that is gonna dispatch either to a call or to a real invocation. Okay, so this method is gonna receive as argument the proxy, the method to be called, and the arguments. Let's call this arguments. Okay, so what this should do, first of all, I said that each time I'm starting a with, I'm setting some arguments in my class, in my mock, so that when I call the method here, I will know that I'm not in a real call like in here, but rather I'm in a collecting call of a binding. So I set an array of arguments, and these arguments are going to be either a result to bind or a method to bind. But nevertheless, these arguments are like a switch. So I set the arguments in a with, and when I call the real method, I'm going to check if the arguments, the switch is set, and if so, this is not going to be a real call that I need to dispatch on, but rather a collecting call. Okay, so what I do in my invoke method first, I check if the arguments, in this case, if these arguments are not null, and if so, I'm gonna collect the arguments of the real call, as you can see. Why is that? I need to pass the arguments of the real call to the binder. As you can see here, when I do this call, I receive some arguments. I need to do a binding for those arguments to a result, so that when I call the method with arguments like this, I will know what to return. In case I don't have an any, but I have a particular value, I need to collect those arguments and map those arguments to a return value that will be later used when I'm calling the method for real. Actually, I'm not calling the implementation for real, I'm calling the mocking, the stub for real. But this is registering and this is using. Okay? So what I do as a trick, when I start a with, I set the arguments, I create the arguments, just to be able, when this method is invoked, to check if the arguments were set or not. If they were not set, then this is what I need to do. I need to dispatch the real call and use it, and use the mapping. But if the arguments are set, the one inside my mock, then when I do this call, I need to collect the real arguments, to pass the real arguments for the next binding, for the returning. This is happening because of the fact that when I'm in a method, I can know with Java which is the method that's calling this, but I don't know which is the context of the caller. So I'm not able to pass these arguments unless I do it inside my mock. Okay? So this is the reason I'm collecting here the arguments. That's one way of doing it. But then I need also to know which is the method that I'm binding for. Yeah, so this is one way of doing this. And then the problem I will have is that I still need to return something. So it's not okay if I don't return anything. In here I return null, but null is not all the time appropriate for what I need to return, because I'm returning something in here. The return value is not going to be used actually for real, but it does count if I need to check the type of the return value, because this is depending on the type of the return value, it's gonna bind to a different binding. But let's fix this later. Okay, so I need actually what I need to do here is to return the default value of a primitive type, of a type actually. Okay, so what I will need to do would be get the method, get the return type, and then get the default value for that. So let's just create in here a private method in order to handle this, and I'm gonna say get default value for this type, get default value of this type. So I'm just creating the method to get the default value. Okay, and for now I'm gonna return just null. This is not right all the time, but we'll fix this. Okay, so yep, now I return the value. That's happening when I register a value. Okay, when I have to invoke what I registered before, I'll do, it will be a different story when I call this add here. Now let's just continue with implementing our logics. So what we'll do when doing a binding, when I bind the result, I have to check if the method is not null, and also the arguments are not null. The arguments are set when I start the with, but if I don't do a when, then the method will not be set. And not the when itself is setting the method, but rather the call of the method inside a with. So when I do a with, I set the arguments, and when I call the method, if the arguments in the mock are set, then this is going to collect the arguments of the real call. If it's a matcher, then we'll have to handle this differently. In the end, when I do a then return, I collect a binding, a binder, and in here I check that the method is not null. This means that the add was called before or after with, and that the arguments are not null, and of course in this case I will receive the arguments of the collecting call. Okay, so what I do here in the binder, the problem that I have is that I need to collect somehow the arguments. Okay, so what I need to put in my mock would be a sort of mapping. So I define a private map field which will have bindings for each method. So the method would be the key, but the bindings would be a map themselves. I'm gonna create a class, an arguments key, and the value will be a mock result. The mock result will be of type any, and this is gonna be the result. So I need to create this class. I'm gonna create the class, but I will create it enclosed to my class. So I'll just have a class in here. The class itself can be private. I don't want to expose this to the world. Okay, so this should be a private class. When I'm creating the mock, nevertheless, I need to create the bindings for the results. Okay, so I have the class, I have the static methods, but let's just create, in this case, this can be private. I don't want to create the mock outside, but I will start with calling the mock method. So when I'm creating the mock, I would like to be able to create, let's say, a hash map, and this hash map will store the results. Okay, so as you can see, I'm collecting for each method a binding of mock results depending on the matchers. The matchers can be either a real value or a selector. Okay, now let's just continue with this. What I do when I actually register a binding, I'm gonna check if the result does not, if I don't have a result for the method, a binding for the method, because then I need to put one. So here I check, I need to check, okay, if my results does not contain a key of the method that I need to bind. Okay, so if this doesn't contain a key, then I need to put a map. So I say something like results put for the method, and in here I just create a new age map of argument key and mock result of type A. So this is the first step. The second step would be to create the key for the arguments. So I then create an arguments key, this should be my arguments key. I create a new arguments key, and I put the arguments as a parameter for the constructor. So I change the constructor to receive the arguments called by the key. And then I do something like I get with results, I get the method key, and then I put a mapping with the arguments key and the result. Remember that here I bind a call of a method with some given arguments to a result. So what I do the mapping, I define a new mapping for these arguments to a result when the method is called. But then I need to do some other stuff here. If the method was not null, if I continue doing then return and so on, it is not possible by the syntax, but nevertheless, I need to clear my state. So I say something like method should be null, and also the argument should be null. not the arguments, but the arguments inside my class. So this should be enough. With a method that's simple, it can never be used unless the arguments are set. But with the arguments, this is mandatory to do, because as you can see here, if I let the arguments set and I do the call here, the call will check if the arguments are set, and instead of returning the mapping, the return value that should be computed, it will actually collect the call. So I set the arguments to be null just to be able to invoke the method with what I defined previously instead of invoking it to collect. Okay, so now the other part, it's done. Okay, the binding. Now I have to deal with invoking the method for real. So if I don't have the argument set, then the invocation should be done for real. So I mean in this case, not in this one. Okay, so this means that I like to get the binding and invoke the method for real. But in order to get the binding, I need to compute the arguments key and check if it is present in the mappings. So let's just create an arguments key. Let's just call this new arguments key because it is. I'm gonna create a new one, and this time I'm gonna create a new arguments key based on the actual arguments received. So I'm in here, I received this, and I create an arguments key. What I do here, I'm gonna check if my arguments key it is present in the mapping. So let's just define a second arguments key. Let's just call this argument key, and I'm trying to find out if I have one. I iterate with an arguments key. Let's call this existing arguments key through all the keys of the mappings. So I have the method, I then get the binding for the method, I get the key set of this, and what I do here, I'm checking if the existing arguments key equals with the new arguments key, and of course I need to override the equals. If so, I will then store the arguments key as being the existing one that I found, and I'm gonna break this. Okay. I still have an issue if there is no binding for the method, because here I will get a null pointer exception, but nevertheless I'm not handling this directly, so this will be thrown, and I expect that the methods will fail if I don't have a binding registered before for what type of value I'm using. Okay, in the end, if I have the arguments key, if my arguments key that I'm trying to find it's not null, so I have a binding, then what I need to do is I get the mock result of any, I don't know what will be the value. So I do something like results dot get of method, and then dot get of arguments key, and this is the actual result. Okay, and if the result has a method, get method, then I will invoke the method. So I can say something like return result dot get method dot invoke, and I pass the arguments as object. Okay, or else I return the result get value. Otherwise, if I don't have a value here, I will throw a new unsupported operation exception, okay, because the method is not supported by the binding, and I provide the name of the method. And of course I don't have to return anything after that. Okay, so of course I can do the same just for the sake of the demo. If I don't have a binding for the method here, so I can check here even before doing the stuff with the arguments, I can check if the results contains a key for the method, and if not, then I can throw the unsupported method exception as well. Okay, because I don't even have any binding for the method. Or I can check here if results.get of method, it's not. And if so, I have no binding for the method. After that, I try and see if I have a binding for the arguments actually, and if so, then I can invoke the method. Otherwise, I will throw an unsupported method exception, and that's all. And in order to have a clear code, I can just throw this before, and then I can do my logic without too many blocks. Okay, so that's simple. That's easy. I do the mapping like this. Now all I have to do is to implement the arguments key, because as you can see here, I'm checking if I have a binding for these arguments. So I go here in my inner class and I then create the binding. So what I have to store in the constructor would be to create a field called arguments and store this. So I need to create the field in here, okay, and then I need to override the equals method, okay. So I check if my object equals to another object, and this is all I need to do with this. Okay, that's an easy one. First of all, if object is not an instance of arguments key, so it's like if the target, I check the object to be an instance of arguments key, and if not, it's clear they cannot be equal. I return false. Next, this is saying that it has to be referred with the mock. Okay, so if it's not, because arguments key is not public. If it's not, then I will return false. But otherwise, I need to cast this to an arguments key. So this is going to be an arguments key. Let's call this arguments key, and I cast to an arguments key the object. Okay. Of course, when I do the cast, I can get an unchecked warning. And now what I'm trying to do is to see if my arguments are null and the arguments key that's provided as target also has null arguments. If it doesn't have null arguments, then I'll have an issue. Or my arguments are not null, but the arguments key has null arguments. So I have different, I have an OR in here. I have different case. Then I return false. Okay. But still, it is possible that I have different arguments like so. So my arguments dot length, it's different than the arguments key which I'm comparing with dot arguments dot length. So in either case, either I have null arguments but the target doesn't have, or I have non-null arguments but the target does have null arguments, or the length of the arguments are different, then I will return false. Otherwise, I need to compare the exact value of the arguments. So what I do here, I'm pretty sure that arguments is not null, arguments key dot arguments is not null as well. So what I do here, I iterate with the key. They have the same length, so it doesn't matter which array I'm using for the length. And what I do here, I check if arguments of I it's different than null, and then I check if it is different than the arguments provided by the comparison. So if it's different, arguments of I is not equal with arguments key dot arguments of I, then if so, they are not equal. Okay, so if I have this, I will return false. In the end, if we passed all these tests, then I'm going to return true, and it should be true. Okay, so what I have here, it's a simple framework with only one issue: the fact that I'm returning null as the default value of the method. So we need to check this. So the problem we have is with the default value. For instance, if I try to run this as it is, I will get a null pointer exception, because when I invoke the method in here, I'm returning the default value, which is null. Okay, so the get default value is returning null. If, for instance, I debug this as the application, I can see that I'm returning null. And when I return null, the second step that I do is to consume this value, which is null. Okay, so let's fix this. This is not going to be easy, but it's not so that complex anyway. So what I do here, I need to check, in order to return the default value, either if the type is an array or not. If it's an array, then I need to return an empty array. So I use the array from reflection to create a new instance. I need to provide the type of the component, and this is the component type, and 0 elements. So this is going to be the default for an array. It's going to be an empty array. Nevertheless, if it's not an array, then I need to create the default for it. And what I'm going to do here would be to create a field to hold the default values. So I need to create in here a private static field which will hold the default values. I can declare this final as well, because this is actually a constant. So let's call this default values. this should be a hash map. Okay, I need to define the type of the field first. So the field will be a map, and it will do a mapping. So this will be a map. It will do a mapping for a class with an object that's going to be the value. So I create this field to be a new h map, and in the end, when I return the value, all I have to do is to return from these default values to get the appropriate key based on the type. If I don't have the value for the type, it will return null, like for complex types. But for primitive types, it will have to return the value of the primitive type. So one way of doing this would be to put something inside my map. And this is going to be actually quite strange, what I'm going to do here. Because I do something like this. When I create the map, I can declare fields inside my class. And for instance, I can say something like, I'd like to have some fields here. Okay? Why do I do that? I define fields in order to get me the default values initialized with the class. So I extend the class and I define a boolean. This is going to hold a boolean value. Okay? Of course, the field is not used, so I need to suppress the warning, because I'm not going to use the field rather than forgetting the value. Okay. Then I need to do the same with some other type of values, like byte value. Okay, so I define here the byte value. Of course, is going to be a byte, and it's not going to be used at all. Then I need to define a short value. Sorry for having to write all this. But for each primitive value that I have, I need to define the appropriate value in here. Then I need to have an integer value, which is going to be an int here. Then I will have a long value, all the primitive types that we have. A long value, it's a field as well. Then I have a float value. Sorry, float value, and so on. Like for instance, I have a double value in here, double value. Not forget about a char value. So this is going to be a character value. Okay, that was easy. I'm just defining some fields inside an inline extended class. Sorry, this is going to extend a hash map. Why I'm doing that? I have a static initializer here. I have an initializer actually. And what I need to do, I need to put in my class the mapping of the default value. So I just define these fields in order to have them set to the default values for the primitive types. And now I do something like this. I then define a field. I get the class of this. You see why this is not a static block? Because I have this .get class, and then I get the declared fields. With all the declared fields, I then do something like with my map, I put for the field .get type, which is the type, for instance, for boolean I will have a key and so on, and then I'll get something like field .get of this. Okay, this can throw exceptions, so I will just surround this with a try catch. As well, but let me fix this before, so I will just surround this with try catch block. So if I have an exception, that can be illegal access exception or illegal argument exception, then I will just throw a runtime exception. So this will be a new runtime exception of E. Runtime exception. Runtime. New runtime exception of E. So what I do with this, because I have all the fields defined, they will be assigned with the default value, and with an instance initializer block, I visit all the fields that are declared here. I get the value of the field is inside my class. Since I'm inside the class, I'm able to access a private field. I get the default value that's already been initialized, and I assign for the key, which is the type of the field, I assign the value. Okay, and now I run this again, the Java application. As you can see, for an even value, I get the true result because I'm assigning the value with the mock, but for an odd value, I get a false. So the mocking, as it is implemented here, allows me to start registering the bindings with a with. When a method is called with some selectors, I can register a result for the method, and in the end, when I consume the method, the binding will be actually used. In this case, I can bind either to a value or to a method to compute the value with some objects array. So in order to do so, I did some tricks. Like for instance, I'm setting a context within my mock when I start the with clause, the with statement, the with call, so that when the method will be called, it will know that this is not the real call, but a call to collect a mapping. So when I do this, I know by the object set in my mock that I'm collecting something. And in the end, I do a mapping and I register for the name of the method, and for the arguments that are used in the call, I'm registering a binding to a result. The result can be either a method call or a plain value. When I call the method for real, because the argument switch is not set, this will not collect the call, but will try to see if it contains a binding for the result, for the arguments, and then will return that. If I didn't put any integer here, but let's say I put 1 here, and I then call the method as it is, I will get an exception saying that the method was not supported for other values, because I don't have a binding for any integer as I can receive in here. Okay, so this is how it works. This is how it's supposed to be collecting mappings, and this is how reflection can be used in order to mock objects which are interfaces basically, or which are of a type that implements interfaces. So the limitation when using reflection with this is that I'm not able to call methods which are not defined in an interface. I can mock a class, but I can only call methods of the interfaces implemented by that class. Okay, so this is the issue. Of course, if I run this again with the appropriate mapping for any integer value, then as you can see, it will work properly. Thanks.